Hello, my name is Paxton Hicks, and today I'm going to be giving a presentation that I gave for Oakland University's Psychology Research Series. This presentation is just some work that I've been working on for our lab, the FF-TIP lab. This is revisiting social penetration theory, self-disclosure topic changes. First, we should get into one of the core topics of this presentation, self-disclosure. Self-disclosure is the verbal sharing of personal information with another individual. There are a couple questions that we should try to answer here, like why do we self-disclose? Well, one big reason is relationship development. When we share information with others, they may like us, and in turn, they may share something like a piece of information with us, and then we start to like them. It's this reciprocal process of sharing back and forth that can help develop friendships, relationships between romantic partners, and even closer bonds within families. But there's a question that might come to your mind. How do we kind of navigate the different topics that we share? What makes one topic easily accessible in a certain relationship compared to another? Like, are you going to tell every piece of information to a stranger, or are you going to wait until certain stages? So, social penetration theory was one of the early kind of classic theories that talked about this and described self-disclosures in two different characteristics. There's breadth, which is essentially the range of topics that people might talk about. And then there's depth, which is the intimacy or like the value that information might hold. So, just a quick example. If I'm meeting someone for the first time and they're a stranger, I might have several surface level topics that I'm able to share or comfortable with sharing. Maybe the school I go to, what I do for work, and maybe some like common small interests, nothing that's too personal, or at least what I would consider personal. Then there's intimate information, so something that's a little bit more talking about your family. Maybe you talk about some of your future plans. Maybe you talk about some of your opinions or problems that you have going on. And then there's core information, which is deeply prejudicing and deeply personal information. So maybe traumatic experiences that you've had. Maybe it's things to do with your dreams or other very major experiences that may be personal to you. So a little quick exercise that I want to do, just so we're in the topic of this, think for a moment, what topics do you think you could share with a stranger? Just in your head, pick out topics, and we'll go on to, you can pause the video if you'd like to do this. But now we're going to do the same thing, but just think for a moment, what topics do you think you could share with a close friend? Again, pause the video if you'd like to participate in this exercise, but hopefully some of the topics that were selected during stranger and close friend could be different. Some might have some overlap, but there could be some differences. So in this, I wanted to see what topics you maybe picked for one party versus the other, because this might tell us a little bit about which topics are intimate or more valuable, harder to share. Social penetration theory is a bit vague. They talk about topics that would reveal the core self, private personal information, but what people consider private might be subjective. There may be individual differences in sharing tendencies when it comes to these different topics. There are a lot of topic measures or like self-disclosure measures that describe different topics like daily habits, deep feelings, fear, pride, other relationships, talking about those things. Some of those things might be more surface and some of those things might be more personal, but there's not a definitive answer. It may be context dependent. So we also have vulnerable information that some studies look at, as well as topics that we avoid that might inform our kind of thinking when it comes to what topics are ones that people easily access versus those that are not easily accessible. So just to get this across, self-disclosure is a mixed bag and it might be measured differently at different times. So there's a lack of uniformity in my opinion. And these kind of create some problems. So for one thing that we should all kind of consider is that the same topics might have more intimate details within them. Talking about your family, for example, you might be able to state factually you have a brother or sister or a mom and a dad, but does that mean it's necessarily intimate? Now, if you start talking about your family problems, that might be a bit more intimate. Also, this three domains kind of idea or rule of thumb, I'm not exactly sure specifically how they formulated that. There might be more rings, so it's important to kind of identify the structure of topics. And lastly, too, this is important because when we share is an important consideration for this kind of research, because the question of when people share could look very different. So, for example, when do people share If we go with the original conceptualization of social penetration theory, we might see that as a relationship develops, the barriers between different information kind of permeate or become porous. So we identify the topics the same, we treat intimate topics still as intimate, and yet we're more willing to disclose those same topics. An alternative way of thinking of this is maybe that instead of the barriers becoming permeable or maybe topics shifting from different, or I'm sorry, the layers becoming more permeable and topics remaining the same intimacy, we just allow people to have that information. Maybe there could be reclassification that goes on to where people unconsciously or consciously think different topics are surface, intimate, and core, and kind of do like this shuffle. So maybe those inner topics are still highly regarded, but maybe there's more of a blending of what's intimate, what's surface, this and that, depending on the stage of the relationship. And again, it's an important consideration because how we think about this and how people operate in their minds can formulate how we answer these questions so we get at self-disclosure correctly. So there are some alternative theories that we should talk about. There's two main ones that I think would relate to these things. There's the disclosure decision models. These essentially can get at when people disclose, but it's more about the motivations and balancing of costs and benefits when it comes to sharing information. And again, maybe the cost and benefits analysis is going to identify which ones are different intimacies, but it may not get at the whole picture of maybe topics changing or moving, so to speak. There's also relational framing. So depending on the audience, we might change what information we access or how we present ourselves, which may then kind of get at topic changes or what we access. I'm not exactly sure if it does get at that reclassification because it's kind of maybe identities that we put on depending on the audience. So just theories that I wanted to put out there that didn't quite fit what we were trying to do or what we were interested in. So the purpose of this is to understand more in-depth characteristics of self-disclosure topics, changes across relationship stages, which is pretty common or pretty well studied, but maybe changes within the same topics, as well as how might topics and their organization change at different relationship stages. So for our hypotheses, we had two main ones with some subsections. So hypothesis one is that topics should be increasingly disclosed at different relationship stages. This is like the classic social penetration theory where when you become closer, you should share closer details. So disclosure should increase within the same topics, demonstrating that depth can happen within maybe surface, intimate, or core topics. Also, topics should be shared at different rates, with less intimate topics being shared the most, intimate in the middle, and core being shared the least. This would get at kind of how we might be able to classify or identify topics for some individuals that might be a surface topic, intimate, and core, if such labels even exist. Because maybe there's people who they share everything, and there might be individuals who share nothing, and they're very closed off in that way. There's also hypothesis two, which is how topics are organized should change across relationship stages. So specifically, more intimate relationships may have a different structure for the information shared compared to less intimate ones. What that means is that when you're best friends with someone, maybe you reorganize or group more topics together compared to if you were just friends with that person or maybe strangers. So in order to accomplish this, we had a small sample just to kind of pilot this and look at it. We had 100 participants who either completed a study in a lab or an online survey for class credit. 90 were retained for the analysis because this could be due to missing responses if they didn't fill out certain survey portions, as well as if they weren't paying attention and didn't meet attention check standards that we had for this study. Survey data was analyzed, although there were other unrelated measures that are not covered in this presentation today. And we see on the right-hand side here, we had a typical college sample where it was about 20 years of age, give or take 3 years, predominantly female and predominantly white, which may hurt the generalizability of our sample, but we will proceed and move forward with what we have. So for the study itself, we used a measure what I tentatively call topic maps. What we do is we ask participants how much they would share on a variety of topics. So these could be things like, hobbies, media, weather, how your day is going, versus maybe like your relationships, politics, opinions, and values that you hold. And then lastly, some topics that might be more core or like trauma, stressful life events, and secrets. We asked all these same questions, all these same 36 topics, but we were asking participants at each time to think about a different person. So think about a stranger at first. What are you willing to share on all the different topics? Then take that same individual and now imagine them as your friend, and then rate the same items again. Lastly, we did the exact same exercise, except now I was with a best friend. All of these topics were on a 1 to 5 Likert scale, 1 being that they would share no details, and 5 being that they would share all details. And 0 was a not applicable option, which was excluded from the analyses, but we also accounted for individuals who may not be able to share about certain topics. The plan of analysis for hypothesis 1 is we did repeated measures ANOVA, and we did it in 2 different ways. First, we wanted to be able to see if there are differences in the willingness to share these different topics within all the different topics. So, are we able to maybe identify topics that might be more surface, intimate, and core in that way? We also wanted to see if the same topics are shared more at different relationship stages. So 1A, the little pictograph there, shows that we might be able to see the ratings and how they're different across different topics to get at which ones might be more surface, intimate, and core. And then in 1B here, we can see we can take that same topic and how we design this, we can actually look at when they're thinking about a stranger, a friend, or a best friend, how they would share that same topic. And this would get at the hypothesis 1 if they share more at different stages of the relationship and if they share more within the same topics. We also have plan of analysis 2 here. We were doing a factor analysis, which basically is a line of statistics which acts to simplify data. If you've got a lot of different items, you might want to be able to get at immutable or simpler traits that you are able to measure within your sample. So it's typical in scale development and replication work. It lets you know how much of the variance in your sample you're accounting for with your factor structure, and it gets at these latent factors that items fall under to help organize topics. So for our purposes, we use this as a way to see what topics were shared more, maybe intermediately, and less, which would get at maybe what social penetration theory calls surface, intimate, and core information. We first did an EFA to just see what it could look like, just because there isn't a concrete factor structure despite what the previous research has done. They haven't really used latent factors to look at like a willingness to share and these different categories of information. We also later, as an exploratory thing or just to see what we could do, we ran a CFA and observed metric invariance to see perhaps if different relationship stages had the same factor structure, same factor loadings, everything like that. We'll explain a little bit more as we go along. First, we just wanted to show the descriptives of all the different topics. I highlighted a few, but this is just at a glance what it looks like mean-wise. We can see that some topics such as trauma were shared maybe on a mean of about 1, so very low share rate when it comes to sharing it with a stranger. Same thing with mental health and other topics. But future plans and values were a little bit in the middle, and pets and media are a little bit higher. These are all just descriptive, so we're not really doing any hypothesis testing yet. I just wanted it to be available, the means and standard deviations of each of these different topics, all 36. We can also see those same means and standard deviations for when thinking about a friend, and we can see the same means and standard deviations when thinking about a best friend for all the same topics. For our first hypothesis test, we wanted to see if different topics exhibited different intimacies or willingness to share the topics so that we can see if there may be more surface, more intimate, and more core topics. We ran this and we found with these items that seem to be emblematic of those different categories that yes, across those different relationship stages at friend, stranger, and best friend, they were different. They were distinguished from one another, and the effect sizes were relatively high. So we can see that there are topics that might be considered more surface and are shared more readily, and there are topics that are more core or very intimate, very personal that are shared the least. So surface information was typically shared more than intimate and core, and intimate information was typically shared more than core. We also saw here too that There we go. Okay. I was just showing the different relationship stages there. So what we can see here is we also wanted to look at it within the same topics and see if at the stranger level, friend level, and best friend level, if those topics were shared, more or less, just to look at social penetration theory. Well, we ran this test across all 36 topics and we found varying effect sizes, but all of them were relatively large and looked at more information was on average shared at the best friend level compared to both friend and stranger, and more information was shared at each topic and for each topic with a friend compared to a stranger, showing that social penetration theory effect that when you're closer or when you're better friends, you share more information. And this is the same thing. The first one was for hobbies, then we did it for values, just to show an example. And we also did it for trauma. And it seemed like some of these topics that were more core definitely showed those effects and were stronger. For the exploratory factor analysis results, I want you to focus on this first column here, but we found a 10-factor structure. We suppressed any correlations that were relatively small, so about 0.3. We relied on eigenvalues of greater than or equal to 1, and this accounted for about 70% of the variance in the sample. What I want to show here is that for this one for strangers, there was about 12 or so topics, give or take, that were on this first common factor with a lot of these different cross loadings in between. These cross loadings might indicate that there's other factors that it's picking up on, although exploratory factor analysis can sometimes, depending on the sample size, depending on the items, inflate how many factors are there. But I just wanted to show this trend that's happening where if we look at friends here, now we've jumped to about 16 topics that all fall within this first common factor. Give or take, there's still some cross-loading, so it might not be the cleanest, but I just wanted to show where our heads were at when we were looking at this data and trying to find these factor structures. So in this one here for the friends, we did the same exact thing, and it was about 69% of the variance that was accounted for by this factor structure of 9 factors at friends. Lastly here, for best friend, we had an 8-factor structure, is about 71% of the variance, and we can see here that it was actually like upwards of like 20 to 24 topics, give or take, that were on this first common factor. So it seems like they're all kind of condensing in a way. Granted, there are still some cross-loadings. There might be other pockets of information that are related to each other or might show that there are topics that correlate, but there's this common factor or this push of all these topics that are moving into a certain direction that intrigued us and we wanted to know a little bit more. So here, after all that work, we wanted to put social penetration theory to the test and see specifically what a 3-factor structure could kind of look like. So we took the topics that seemed to be the most emblematic of this 3-factor structure, we forced a 3-factor structure to look at the different relationship contexts. We forced a 3-factor structure and we did this for all 3 of the different relationship contexts, and we found 3-factor structures. On the right hand of the bubbles there, those are the topics that seem to be the most emblematic of a willingness to share surface, a willingness to share intimate, and a willingness to share core topics. At this 3-factor structure, we did see that there was less variance explained. So there was about 47% of the variance explained by in stranger, 59% in friend, and 62% in best friend. We did this as a sort of data prep and an examination of what social penetration theory could look like if we were to fit like a 3-factor structure. So back to what I was talking about before when it comes to measurement and variance, it establishes if a measure is working across groups. So if you have a factor structure or a measure where you're really trying to look at personality trait X, you want to make sure that that personality trait translates across groups. This might be good in like multicultural work or cohort work. When you measure work ethic, is it going to be the same construct in a older generation or a population where work ethic was a little bit different than what it might be at the present? They're just things that you want to consider when it comes to your measures and how you do it. We did the same thing, except instead of groups, like in other work, like multicultural work where you do different populations by culture or different cohorts, we did our same measure where we looked at the different relationship contexts. We need to establish a couple different things to see if there is a similar or different factor structure. We need configural invariance, which basically says, is the factor structure the same? Are the same kind of items on the same factors? Is it the same number? Are there factors that are moving around or maybe closely resemble or closely aligned with other factors? If we fail that, then it might mean that the factor structure is changing. There's also metric invariance. If we find configural invariance, we can also then establish, are the factor loadings the same? Is an item that is surface level going to remain an indicator of surface level topics at the different relationship stages? And lastly, too, we did scalar invariance, which is, are the item intercepts the same? Meaning, are the items being endorsed at the same level at the different relationship contexts? So is a 1 at the stranger stage going to be the same as a 1 or a 2, maybe close depending, a 2 at the friend stage, and so on and so forth. We followed the guidelines here for changes in fit. If we exceed any of these or too many of them are exceeded, that means that we may have violated an assumption, meaning that we don't have any of these invariances that we're establishing with our test. So for the first one, configural invariance, we had a model fit, which was fair fitting, I would say. When we look at the different model fit statistics, we had good fit, although the RMSEA, the confidence interval was a little bit outside of where it should be. So it's just something to tentatively look at as we keep looking at this. We're going to go with it for now, just because this is an experiment or we're just testing the data, see what we're doing here. The factor structure held, meaning that across those 3 different relationship stages, so for strangers, friends, and best friends, we found that the surface, intimate, and core factors that we had held. It held consistent. Then we looked at metric invariance. What we have here is the different change statistics in the fit, and we found most of them were acceptable except for the SRMR. It was just 1 violation, so perhaps we could say that it's retained, although other people may say that it's violated. For our purposes, we're going to keep moving forward. We want to keep exploring this and using this as a test to see what we can do with this kind of testing. So for tentative purposes, factor loadings are similar amongst the different relationship contexts. What that means is that pets being a surface topic is the same intensity or same strength to a surface topic at the stranger, the friend, and the best friend factors. So basically what we're saying is that pets is going to be considered a surface topic at the same level or same intensity at these different relationship stages. Lastly, we have scalar invariance, which we violated. So basically, all the different fit statistics got worse, and we can see that item intercepts differed across relationship stages. So willingness to share certain topics differed across these different relationship contexts. We might expect that because of social penetration theory, these different relationship stages are going to have people more willing to share each of these items, in different ways. And we can kind of demonstrate this here. This is similar to the repeated measures results that we saw before, but a topic like trauma at the stranger level, it was emblematic of core, but it was endorsed less. It was shared a lot less. Trauma for a friend, it was shared a little bit more, and then at best friend, it was shared a bit more or a lot more, just depending on the scale of it. But the item intercepts are not equal. That means that we failed scalar. So when we're looking at these different scales at different relationship stages, there might be other things predicting that measurement. So just something to consider. It might be something that you would kind of expect given the relationship stuff that we're doing. But when we get into our discussion here, we can kind of see a pattern. So hypothesis 1A and B, they were supported. Topics were shared at different rates, both by topic intimacy and relationship intimacy. We saw some topics that were more surface were really shared less than other topics, or at least a willingness to share them was less. We also saw relationship intimacy affected. So the same topic, if you look at trauma, hobbies, values, if you look at pets, individuals were more willing to share more details on all the different topics with a best friend compared to a friend and a stranger, and then the same effect was there for sharing that information with a friend compared to a stranger. We replicated quite a few findings, at least with this study, when it comes to social penetration theory, that relationship intimacy is very important for how we share information. There was also a bit of item differentiation, so there were some indicators that some topics are surface, some topics might be intimate, and some topics might be core. We also found depth within the same topics, which is very interesting. So the same topic, individuals had indicated that there might be more details that they could share about each topic, even if we didn't tell them specifically what details they could share. For hypothesis 2, I'm going to tentatively say that it was partially supported, although there's a lot more work that needs to be done here. So the factor structure showed some instability in our EFA, but there also could be stable elements like we saw in the CFA. So that confirmatory factor analysis showed when we do have that three-factor structure and we use the best items for it, then we might see some invariance metrics. Social penetration theory in this way kind of holds. There really is this like three-factor structure that could be there. Although, granted, in the EFA, maybe there's more factors, maybe within those different factors, maybe there's different subsections of intimate information or subsections of core. Maybe that factor structure also depends on what experiences an individual has. For our purposes, it's a little bit up in the air, and I hate to be wishy-washy, but there could be some elements that are unstable and some elements that are stable, and maybe there's context factors that affect the instability of different topics. The decision disclosed could be based on thresholds, not topic reorganization. So individuals might really be holding some topics to a standard of it being intimate and waiting for a certain relationship stage to occur before sharing it, rather than this radical idea of reorganization or completely stripping down and looking at topics differently. Topic organization may show some structured elements. Relationships change the willingness to share, not necessarily the structure of the topics that then changes sharing behavior. And sharing shifts upwards at different relationship stages, kind of like what we saw before. There are some limitations that we should talk about when it comes to this study. It's very important to address this. So the small sample, this was really a test or just to kind of show what we're trying to do, a proof of concept, if you will. But it should be noted that this is a very small sample and we're really pushing a lot of this stuff to the limit. But in that way, it's a little bit exciting or a little bit fun that we get to do this. So small sample, we need to acknowledge that. There also might be alternative explanations to some of the factor structure. Some of those items might be very similar, like talking about your, hobbies and games and activities. Those might be related to each other just because they're very similar. So there are other things that might indicate the factor structure is picking up on other things, like maybe topic intimacy. But it should be noted there could be alternative explanations for the overabundance of factors there. I mentioned this earlier, but the college sample hurts a little bit of our generalizability. So because we have our sample and it's very younger, a younger pop or a younger sample, there might just be a increased willingness to share information about these different topics versus maybe potentially older generations. Maybe they share a little bit less, or maybe they share even more towards the later stages of their life. So it all depends. These are also survey responses, so they're not causal in any way. Although we are modeling it or trying to say these things, it isn't causal. These may or may not mimic real situations. If you find yourself with a stranger, you might share less than you thought. You might even share more depending on the context, depending on what you're, how you're feeling in that moment. It all depends. The invariance testing that we did was conducted with the most ideal model. What I mean by that is we kind of picked the ones that were the highest factor loading possible. So we didn't see some of those items that had bigger cross loadings to maybe see, to put it in a better way, because the items were very pure or didn't have cross loadings, we may have missed out on the opportunity to look at instability. When we collect more data or as we keep working with this, we might be able to include some of those more unstable elements and see the changes. So maybe there are some elements that are stable while there's others that are less stable. Measurement differences, willingness. So this was just something about the survey, but willingness might not get at everything when it comes to self-disclosure. So there could be other words or other things that you could test or retest to really look at differences in how people are responding to this. But for our purposes, willingness was really getting at a decision or when people decide to share different topics. Within subjects, dependencies may not be captured in the CFA. So participants, all 90 of them, were asked the different scales 3 times. We modeled them separately, so there could be within subject differences that we're not capturing, which we will hopefully be able to address as the samples collected, as we do more. There's potential for like a multi-level CFA or something along those lines that could address those differences, but it should be noted for this presentation, some of those within subject dependencies are not accounted for or present. And also, there is a lack of an established model, highly subjective to change. The original social penetration theory, it said that there were 3 factors, but they didn't do any like factor testing, exploratory factor analysis, anything like this. So typically you do a confirmatory factor analysis once you have a really strong or really established model that you can draw back to and say, this factor structure has been found 20, up teen times. But we didn't have that. So we were really just trying to explore, see what we could do, but self-disclosure might just be very unstable, and different topics are going to be these different things. There might be, again, I keep saying it, but there might be some elements that are stable and some elements that are unstable, but that's what kind of makes it exciting. So a lot more testing is needed in order to understand self-disclosure and maybe its organization. Understanding social penetration theory and self-disclosure explains a facet of relationship development. So understanding what signals we send when we share certain information is important, and it might tell us how people become friends, how people become romantic partners, and how people become closer when it comes to family dynamics. It explains further when topics are shared and the modality of topic sharing. So how close we get, it tells us what information is shared and how we come to those different decisions. And it might help us to understand when there's maybe difficulties in making those decisions. So when people are having a hard time sharing something, we might be able to understand what is at stake or what is making that decision harder, and hopefully either guiding people to a place where they can share it or improve their relationships between individuals. Also, these domain boundaries of topics has a practical use. If we understand what topics are more or less intimate, it could inform certain like policy or decision making when it comes to what topics are or are not acceptable within certain professional or other environments, like in a workplace, other areas that might need this information and say this topic is really something that should not be shared in this space. So that could be something that is done with this work in the future. For future directions, I have a lot of ideas for what this could go in the future. Obviously, there's a further refinement or a need for refinement of self-disclosure models. Maybe some of the other ones like the decision making is good, everything like that. But I think returning to its roots and understanding self-disclosure is very important for understanding when people share topics, and just cutting through the weeds of some of the ambiguity when it comes to which topics are intimate or not. There's also a need for replication at different relationship stages. We did friendship because that's what a lot of different social penetration theory studies have done in the past, but you could do the same thing for strangers that become a couple, a first date. Then you move on to like a third date, and then you move on to like actual commitment. Are there different levels of sharing that might happen there? Maybe we see different effects that we weren't anticipating. Same thing in other different things like coworkers or doctor-patient relationships, everything like that. There's also we need to understand predictors of self-disclosure structure. Maybe there are things that we didn't account for here, such as are there traits like extroversion, introversion, maybe attachment styles or other things that explain where and how people put intimacy on their topics. There's also a need for understanding of like the reversal processes. So for example, if a relationship is dying or people are just growing apart, what topics are shared less first? By understanding some of what we've done here, what grows and which ones take the longest to grow, we can also see which ones maybe go first. Maybe it's those core topics, because they are a marker of the relationship and where it's at. Maybe it's the small talk. Maybe it's not talking about the simple things that indicates the death or decay of a relationship. Also, we need across time, topics. We need to see this in action. We need longitudinal studies where we can look at what topics are being shared, how people respond to it. Maybe even reciprocation plays a role in how people access different topics. So we need in the field, longitudinal studies, diary studies, something to really get at this in time, in real time. Thank you for listening and watching this presentation. I'm glad I got to give it at the Oakland University Research Psych Series. Here are my references here. At the end here, I also wanted to include the different models that we fit for the stranger, for the friend, and for the best friend relationships. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.